everyone. As often happens with working parents, this week all my plans were kerschnuffled up in smoke as my daughter has been ill all week with croup. And I thought, what else could I do besides play with Play-Doh? I know! I'll think of things that people always ask me and see if I can get to the bottom of some of the interesting answers. By the way, I'm the art doctor, Nancy Langham Hooper, PhD, art historian, and cultural enthusiast, ready to use the great art of the world to help you out. If you like these videos, subscribe to my channel, ding the notification bell, and YouTube will tell you every time I upload a video, which is every Friday. So the first question I'm asked all the time is, how can I tell if art is good or bad? This question kind of unearths a minefield of problems. There's really no such thing as good or bad because in order to say something is good or bad, you have to have a set of values that you're judging it against. Any values you come up with, and believe me, people have tried, Ruskin, he really tried. Any values you come up with, somebody will poke a hole in them, guaranteed. So art historians don't go around saying that art is good or bad. We have to justify what we say, so we can talk about its attributes and the things about it, but generally we don't get into, yeah, this sucks, or yeah, this is awesome. Because we can't just come up with some hot take like it's a social media post. Sometimes I use the term successful or not successful to talk about a work of art, in that it's communicating successfully with the viewer or maybe less successfully, not successfully. But even that is super subjective. So basically this means that you are free. You don't need to judge whether something is good or bad. That is not the question you should be asking as you approach a work of art. You should be curious about it. You should ask questions. You should say, what's going on here? What's happening? How am I feeling about it? All the interesting questions. Whether art is good or bad is not an interesting question. It's so subjective, it really doesn't mean anything. So don't worry. Nobody is going to come at you with a scorecard and ask you if you liked it or not and tick you off for the wrong answer. Okay, the next question that everyone asks me is, if my 5-year-old could do that, it can't be art, right? First of all, hold up. What your 5-year-old does is art, including that unintended work of art on your fridge that you can't get off. Try goo-gone. It works. That is art. It doesn't mean that it's going to sell in a gallery, but it's still art. No less art than a Michelangelo. So this is more a question about artistic skill. Does art need to be skillful and sophisticated to count? And how could we measure that? Again, it's a subjective and tough thing, but I think a good example is Jackson Pollock, a famous artist, internationally renowned, practicing in the mid-20th century, was part of the abstract expressionist movement in New York City, and he made massive drip paintings. These are his most famous works. These huge canvases full of dripped paint. And these canvases sell for millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions. But could you do that? Yeah, probably. I mean, it would be hard to duplicate exactly, but you could certainly take a canvas, put it on the floor, drip some paint, follow his technique. That's totally possible. But just because you do that doesn't make you Jackson Pollock. Actually, let's hope that very few people are like Jackson Pollock. I mean, that's just a different discussion. Pollock had the skill, imagination, and creativity to come up with that technique and do it at the time that he did. So he needs credit for originality, but also for the context in which he made his art. In the 50s, the abstract expressionist movement out of New York City was painting chaos, confusion, and uncertainty at a time when society only wanted order and all the nice things to be in a row because the war was traumatic and the 50s were supposed to be a return to normal. But the abstract expressionists are saying, it ain't normal. We're still not over this. So Pollock's confusing drip paintings just vibrate with energy, and they really resonate from society at that time. Kind of their unspoken anxiety and the buzz that was around all this, let's just be normal. So if someone were to come along and do these paintings today, they'd be copying Pollock, but let's just put that aside. If they did something like that today, it wouldn't have the same resonance. This painting was for a particular moment in the late 40s and 50s. It doesn't exist today. You could drip on a canvas, go for it. It's just not going to have that earth-shattering impact of Pollock. So context really matters when we talk about art as original. And getting back to, could your 5-year-old do it and therefore is that bad? Again, that's assuming that there's a certain level of skill that must be present and that must be shown in each work of art in order for it to be real art. And that's just snobby. And that limits creativity. Let's not do that. So the next question everybody always asks me is, why can't artists draw anymore? And I think what they're meaning by that question is the artists they see are not drawing in a realistic way. They might be just doing outlines or cartoony shapes or things that don't look like real people. And when you look to the past, you see that there's lots of drawing that is very realistic and detailed down to shading and lights and fine lines and everything like that. In the mid-19th century, when photography first sprung up, it slowly began to replace the need for traditional portraits. So one of the reasons that you would have your portrait done is to remember. And so of course you would want it to be really good. If you're only going to have one image of you last forever, it better be good. And portraitists knew that. So it would be very realistic. Sometimes it would be a bit idealized, a little flattering, but it would look like you because that's the point. Once photography came about, that was no longer a pressing need. People could use photographs to know what loved ones looked like. And though portraiture still is a huge deal, it is not the central place that it was before photography. It wasn't the only reference. So because you don't need to be exactly realistic or, conform to your client's requests, people can draw in all sorts of different ways. And some people do draw in super realistic ways. This is called photorealism, and it's a style of art that is absolutely astonishing. It looks photoreal. So the question is, why don't they do this anymore? The answer is they do. Lots of people draw that way, just not everyone. And we're lucky that we have the whole range of that existing in our artists today. So can people draw realistically? Heck yeah, they can. They just don't always wanna. Okay, this next one's a bit of a cheat because it's not really a question, but I had to include it because everybody says this to me when I meet them for the first time and I tell them I'm an art historian. They say, "Oh, I don't know anything about art." I think that's a really interesting reaction people have. Sometimes I think people are asking for permission to not know about art, to be forgiven, perhaps, for not being cultured or, up to standard somehow, which if you want that permission, granted. Like I said in my previous video, knowing about art is wonderful, but it's not required. But it's also interesting to think about where that attitude comes from. Because when I was studying 19th century art, you may be surprised to hear that it was basically for everyone. Yes, rich people collected it and they were more likely, to sponsor artists or whatever. But poor people, middle-class people, everybody in society liked art and went to galleries and were encouraged to do it. It was like cinema today. Cinema is an art form, but everybody participates. And, sure, some people like this kind and some people like that kind, and this is considered artsy and refined, and this is considered for the masses. But as an art form, it's pretty populist. Everybody uses it. And that was art, painting especially, in the 19th century. So what happened? Well, there was a split between the art establishment and the rest of popular culture. And you had an art establishment that was increasingly seen as snobby. Maybe they actually were snobby. And, noses in the air. Well, if you don't know about it, then I guess we can't explain it to you. And a lot of the modern art movement of the 20th century kind of had that little clique around it. Like, you just have to know. And so when people found something confounding or confusing, they've learned to blame themselves for not knowing rather than ask questions about the art. You don't need to know a lot about a work of art to appreciate it. If I was a musician, nobody would come up to me and say, "Oh, well, I don't know anything about music." That doesn't mean we can't appreciate Living on a Prayer just because we don't know what key it's in. So I think art needs to be the same way. Let's try and think about art the way we think about music. No, you may not know everything, but you know something, and that's enough. And the final question for today, does art even matter anymore? Short answer, yeah, it does. You knew I'd say that. But the longer answer is, it does because art is one of our most valuable cultural byproducts. Something that reflects our culture, our society, our values, our worries, our fears, our aspirations, our desires, everything that makes now, artists reflect that in so many different ways. Future historians looking back on this time will understand us better by looking at our art. But art is also valuable to help us process what is happening around us. Kind of like a subconscious mind. Art is there to process our feelings, events, and things that are happening, but not necessarily to make sense. So kind of like our dreams come up in response to what's happened in our day and our need to sort that out, our need for our brain to kind of deal with it and categorize it. And art is kind of the same way in our society. It serves that function. We're going through stuff, we're processing stuff, and artists have the most direct way straight to the heart. It's not literal art, it's very visual, so it can encompass a lot of feelings, and it can be confusing and it can be weird, and it kind of should be. So when you look at it that way, art is incredibly valuable and it does matter. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions of your own, or if this has brought up something for you, please let me know in the comments. Ask me questions, tell me your thoughts on these things. I'd love to hear from you. Also, in the description box below, you'll find a few links related to topics that I've touched on today. Right, I'm off to go look after a croupy girl, but I'll be back next week with this week's original plan. Until then, deep breath. You got this. I'll see you next time.